Welcome to the Pushing Past Possible podcast, where we dare to live the impossible. This podcast, we want to talk about and jump into discussions about areas that we believe are impossible. We collectively believe are impossible, right? So we want to talk about areas such as wealth, money, marriage, a few others, weight loss, business. These are areas that people tend to think certain things are impossible in life. And so we want to jump into those, have discussions about those, and demystify and debunk the idea that it's impossible. A little bit about me. I'm an attorney who practiced law in several areas. One, IP law, business law, real estate law, and tax law. I am also a husband of 15 years, as well as a father of 2. And I decided to start this podcast because I wanted to share my ideas and have conversations with not just you, but other people here in the studio, and really gain insight into understanding how we can push past this place that we call possible, right? This comfort zone that we believe that things are possible. How do we get beyond that and live in what we think is impossible, the things that we truly desire? So we are going to jump into today's episode. Today's episode, we're going to stay on the topic of wealth, and we're going to start this series called Exit Strategy. So today we're going to jump into this topic of what is your exit strategy? Right? How do you plan to protect everything that you've built here during your time? One of the things that I find interesting is that people don't like talking about death. People do not like talking about this idea of when they're not going to be here anymore. It makes people sad. There are also these cultural superstitions about talking about death. If we talk about death, then we're going to bring death to us. And the reality of it is, there are two things that are certain in life, as they say, taxes and death, right? So we have to accept that one day we will cease to exist here on earth, and we need to plan for that. Because planning for that protects not only the assets that you've acquired here on earth, but it also protects your family. It protects them from discord and contention, family fighting, which we've seen, whether or not we've seen it publicly or we've seen it in our own families. We've definitely all seen this family discord. We also want to protect the assets, as I said before. We want to make sure that what we've acquired here on earth, what we've built here on earth, we're passing on to who we think deserves it, who we think would best utilize that resource, and we get to have a say in it. So let's jump into it. There's several ways that you can really approach this idea of planning your exit strategy, right? And it's kind of sounds a little kitschy when you say exit strategy, as if, this is a business and you're planning how you're going to sell it or what you're going to do when we get to the end of the business. But in reality, it's the same when we think about life. You have to plan for when we get to the end. So there are some examples that I want you to think of, right? When we're planning, I mentioned business, but there's also budget, right? If we let's debunk this idea that we cannot plan for the end, because when you have money, right, your income, when your check is coming in, you're planning to spend that. It's called a budget. Here's what we're going to do when that money comes in, and here's how we're going to spend it, right? If you're building a house, you know what the end result looks like. You do. It's in the blueprint, architectural plan of some sort. You know what the end is going to look like. You've planned for the end. You planned with the end in mind. The same thing when you weight loss, right? You're trying to lose some weight. You know your goal weight. Right? So let's break this idea that we don't plan for the future. We don't want to think about this. It's going to bring, death to our door. The reality of it is we do plan and we plan for certain events in our lives, and this is no different. There, as I said before, there's several ways we can approach it. We can not plan at all, right? We can just let it be what it is and let life take its course, and the assets that we acquired go to next of kin. Our children go to whomever is willing to take them, and everything else just kind of stays at a standstill. Whatever we have in life insurance, it finds its way to whomever is the next of kin, and resources are spent however they're spent. But I don't think that we have worked so hard and planned our lives so diligently that when it comes to the end, we want to just let the chips fall where they may. The other way is to have a will. That's the first thing everyone should think of, is to have a will in place. And for those of you who don't know what a will is simply just a document that outlines how you want your assets distributed. It informs those who survive you how you want your money, your house, your art, your jewelry, how you want that to be distributed among your family. And let's talk about the pros and the cons of it. The pro is you get to have a say. Unlike the previous approach that we took where it's just a laissez-faire approach, here you get to have a say. You get to say where you want your assets to go. The other pro of it is, unlike any other document, you get to determine who becomes a guardian of your child or children, or any incapacitated dependent that you may have. So here is where you get to say, Uncle Tommy and Aunt Sally will be responsible for managing and taking care of my kids when I am no longer here. They are the best fit. As opposed to the previous approach where you just let the chips fall where they may, and your child ends up wherever they end up. Quick story: we knew a family who both of the parents were no longer. The mother died, and the father was no longer able to take care of the daughter, and the daughter who went to school with my daughter ultimately ended up having to move to Florida and live with her grandmother, and her entire life turned upside down. If you want to have the continuity of life and care that your children are used to, you want to put that in a will, right? You want to make sure that the right people will be responsible for your children. In addition to that, you get to, in a will, determine who manages their funds. If you have children, right? If you have minor children, you get to determine who's going to manage the funds and how they're going to take care of them. Will they provide for their education, their current activities, baseball, ballet, whatever it is? You get to make those determinations before it actually happens. So let's talk about some of the cons of a will. One of the cons is that you will have to endure probate. And what probate is, just in layman's terms, it's just the process of distributing your assets through the court. The court sets a date. It's a pretty long, drawn-out process in which they really determine the estate taxes and what's owed to the government prior to the distribution of the assets. And we'll talk about ways to avoid that. But that's one of the cons. Another con is you have transfer fees, not necessarily taxes, because you're going to pay taxes regardless in some way, shape, or form, but transfer fees. If you're transferring it through a will, a house may have certain transfer fees and other costs associated with it. And finally, another con is that there's limited reach, right? There is limited reach as to how you can affect the future of your assets and your dependents. And I'll contrast that with the next instrument that you should be considering, right? And that next instrument is called a trust. And again, as I said before, I'm going to contrast that with the will. So with the will, I said that you have limited reach. Whereas a trust, you have essentially unlimited reach. You get to determine and dictate not just how your children or your assets are spent in this generation, you can dictate it for the next generation and generations after that. You can determine that certain properties not be sold for 60 years. You can determine that that your children have access to their funds upon a certain date, upon a certain milestone in their lives. So finishing college, getting married, any other milestones that you think would happen along their lives. You get to determine that. You get to determine how much, as I said before, how much of the assets they get and when they get them. You get to determine how much of it you want to give to charity, whether or not the trust can continue to make money, which most trusts do. Unlike a will, it doesn't continue to generate income. A trust can generate income. And I just wanted to take the time to contrast that. Now let's just jump back just briefly. What's a trust, right? I kind of jumped ahead without really explaining what a trust is. A trust is another legal instrument where you get to, again, share how you want to distribute your assets. The difference there is that there is someone called a trustee who manages those assets for you. Now, several types of trusts. One is an estate planning tool, but there are other trusts that aren't necessarily estate planning tools, that maybe are asset protection tools. But what essentially happens is you take the property and you transfer it from your name, the individual's name, to the name of the trust. And the trust essentially becomes a company, almost like a holding company for these assets. There is a level of privacy, so no one can see who actually owns it, depending, and we can go into detail in another video, but depending on the trust itself. But there's a level of privacy. There are the property itself is not necessarily transferred after that. It's owned by the trust. So even when you come to the end of your life, the trust will continue on as its own independent entity. And so the asset itself, let's say it's a house, won't have to be transferred. It will continue to be owned by the trust and the next generation. And the trustee will manage the trust and the funds and everything. So what are some of the pros? We spoke about some of them already. We spoke about privacy. You get to control, you have a very great amount of control of how your assets are distributed. There's no probate, so there's no court administration of it, again, because the asset, the owner, the trust continues to live even after you are no longer here. You get to protect your minors and incapacitated individuals just with a little bit more detail and specificity. Asset protection, we talked about also. And as we mentioned earlier, avoid family disputes. Some of the cons. The biggest con that we have when it comes to the trust is that you must trust your trustees, right? It's kind of a mouthful, but your trustees must be trustworthy people because they will now manage these assets. And depending on type of trust you have, whether it's a living trust where the trust is while you are alive, you will have to go to the trustee to make certain determinations about your assets if you are not the trustee. Now, maybe a little confusing there, but we'll get into more detail later on. But the biggest takeaway is that you must trust your trustee. If the trustee abuses his or her power, then you will have to deal with the consequences whereby they are misusing the funds and the assets to really keep it simple. Also, there's a cost associated with funding the trust, as well as paying trustees or any other parties that are involved in managing the trust. So Those are two of the cons, but overall, I think that the pros, as far as the trust is concerned, outweigh the cons. Let's talk about two other aspects before we wrap up. The first is the power of attorney. And the power of attorney is a document that gives an individual or individuals the power to make decisions on your behalf, usually financial decisions, business decisions, not necessarily healthcare decisions, which we'll talk about later. And so this document allows individuals to access your bank accounts if you're no longer here, or if you're no longer able to. It allows them to make certain other financial decisions on your behalf. It allows them to manage where your life insurance may go, whether or not it ends up in a trust or maybe it ends up somewhere else. And it allows these individuals to, again, make the determination of how your financial assets are dealt with. Now, let's talk about something that we've seen in the news recently, which is the Wendy Williams case. That case is about a power of attorney as well, right? You have an individual who's responsible for making these decisions for you about your money. They are the people managing your money. In Wendy Williams' case, she did not have a power of attorney, or the power of attorney she did have, the court decided or determined that they were not the best fit, and they went with a third party. Now, normally the court doesn't go with a third party. The court goes with the party that you choose, which is why it's important for you to have a power of attorney, someone who is going to make those financial decisions for you when you are no longer able to, or when you're no longer here. So what are the cons? As we talked about the Wendy Williams case, one of the biggest cons is the abuse of power. For the individuals with this power, some of them may abuse it, misspend your money. For those who also have power of attorney over your actual decisions, and they may abuse their power about controlling you. So that is the biggest con about having a power of attorney. Now, there are two types of power of attorney. There is a revocable one where you can revoke it, and an irrevocable one, which obviously is something you can't revoke. And you want to be very careful that the individual that you've given this power to make decisions over your life and over your assets after your life is someone who is trustworthy, someone who you know will make the best decisions for you. The final aspect that we want to talk about is the healthcare proxy. Why is that important? This is important because this individual will make decisions regarding your healthcare when you are unable to do so. Okay, so let's jump back. What is a healthcare proxy or healthcare directive? It's a document that informs healthcare professionals how you want your care to be handled. So in the directive, you may say, do not resuscitate, right? You may have other instructions about how you want your care handled. In addition to that, it gives an individual the ability to make those decisions for you. It provides a proxy on your behalf if you're unable to make these decisions at the end of your life. And, a quick story with that is I once saw a family where there were 4 sisters, and the dying mother gave the healthcare directive to the one daughter who she knew would carry out the decisions. And what ultimately happened is 2 of the daughters decided that when the time came to pull the plug, so to speak, that their mother was not yet dead, and they did not want to let her go. She was still alive. However, the individual with the directive was able to make the choice, the right decision, and allow her mother to transition. Now, what are the pros? Ideally, you avoid conflict. Someone is going to make the decision. There's not going to be a long, drawn-out fight about what has to happen when the time comes. The other thing is that there are clear decisions. You've already made decisions for yourself about how you want your end-of-life care to happen. And those are huge. You may not realize how much that impacts the family, but making those decisions ahead of time allows them to avoid having to carry that weight of making those decisions. Speaking about carrying the weight of making a decision, one of the biggest cons is that the individual you choose has to carry that emotional weight of that decision, right? So while the entire family doesn't have to deal with it, the individual you choose has to be able to hold that emotionally and say, it's time to allow my family member or the person that I love to transition. So in a nutshell, this is how we want to create an exit strategy for ourselves, right? We want to make sure we have determined where our assets are going, to whom they're going to. We want to determine who's going to take care of our children in the event that we're not here. We want to know how they're going to be provided for. We want to ensure that the assets that we've acquired along the way, the house, the rental property, the lake house, the art, we want to determine how that's going to be handled, right? And we want to make these decisions ahead of time because we none of us know when our last day will come. And so we need to make those decisions. We want to make those decisions sooner rather than later. And that's really where we're going to end today, right? So as you think about your exit strategy, it is important that you think about your will, your trust, your healthcare proxy, and your power of attorney. These 4 items make up your exit strategy. So that's it for today. I just wanted to get this message out here, and we will see you next time. And listen, we're starting out, so please like, comment, share, subscribe, everything that people say at the end of these videos. And I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Love you guys.